that Paul McCartney was dead and that you are not Paul McCartney, you're an imposter pretending to be Paul McCartney. Paul.
I'm not Paul. You don't want a fake.
You know, rumors that your father was dead, remember?
Yes.
Okay, first there was the Abbey Road album cover, right?
Paul McCartney's son has revealed the dark truth. The Beatles are a legendary band, renowned for their groundbreaking music, cultural impact, and enduring legacy. Emerging in the 1960s, they captivated audiences with their innovative sound, blending rock, pop, and experimental influences into a unique and revolutionary experience. Their stage presence, characterized by charisma and boundless energy, left an indelible mark on the music industry. But if Paul McCartney's persona was so influential and beloved, why would his son have anything bad to say? Well, you are in for a ride. If you are a fan of Paul McCartney, you are about to hear the truth. But before his son unveils the dark truth, we have to find out who Paul McCartney truly was. Before the fame, Sir Paul McCartney. McCartney's parents were from the lowest rungs of the social class, according to biographer Peter Ames Carlin. But they also experienced moving up the ladder of social classes in their lifetime. On June 18, 1942, in Walton Hospital in the area of Liverpool, Paul McCartney was born to Jim and Mary during the war. Before the war, Jim had worked as a salesman for the cotton merchants A. Haney and Coyon, having been promoted from his job as a sample boy in their warehouse. When the war broke out, Haney's was shuttered, and Jim was employed as a lathe turner at Napier's Defense Engineering Works, volunteering for the fire brigade at night. First, in 1944, the family relocated to a flat in Knowsley, and in 1946, they moved to a municipal housing estate in Speke. Both of these houses were located in Speke. Following the conclusion of the war, the Second World War, Jim went back to his job at the cotton merchants, although his pay was slightly lower than it was before. There was a significant increase in Mary's income from her work as a visiting midwife. Between the years 1947 and 1949, McCartney was a student at Stockton Wood Road Primary School in Speke. However, due to the overcrowdedness of the school as a result of excessive students, he transferred to Joseph Williams Junior High in Belle Vale. In 1953, he was one of just 3 students out of 90 that successfully passed the 11+ examination. This meant that he was eligible to enter the Liverpool Institute. This was a grammar school rather than a normal secondary school. On the bus that took him to school from his suburban home in Speke in 1954, he was introduced to his fellow student, George Harrison. It did not take long for the two to become friends. McCartney would later say of the friendship that he tended to talk down on him because he was a year younger. It can be said that music was born with McCartney as his father was a pianist and trumpeter who headed Jim Mack's jazz band in the 1920s. He was named after his father. In addition to encouraging his kids to pursue music, he also recommended that McCartney take piano lessons. He maintained an upright piano in front of the room. However, McCartney was more of an audio learner than a studious one. When he was just 11, his father pushed him to try out for the church choir at Liverpool Cathedral. But as fate would have it, he was not admitted into the choir. Following that, he became a member of the choir at St. Barnabas's Church in Mossley Hill. His father gave him a nickel-plated trumpet for his 14th birthday. But when rock and roll became popular on Radio Luxembourg, he traded it for a Framus Zenith Model 17 acoustic guitar that cost £15. He did this because he wanted to be able to play the guitar while he was singing. He showed so much promise as a young man, one could almost tell that he was going to be famous. As a young man, McCartney had his first encounter with loss at a young age. How did that shape the man he grew to become? How did that help forge a lifetime friendship with John Lennon? How did he overcome adversity? dealt a tragic hand. In the year 1956, the McCartney family suffered a terrible blow. Their lives took a tragic turn when his mother passed away from breast cancer after a long battle with the disease. This very emotional occurrence served as the impetus for the creation of the legendary Let It Be, and it is very possible that it played a part in the formation of the heartfelt lyrics of Yesterday. That was something that McCartney revealed in an open and honest interview with Stephen Colbert. In the beginning, he did not consider the death of his mother to have a direct impact on his musical compositions. On the other hand, as time went on, he became aware of the significant influence that her absence had on his musical journey. Also, during the interview, he disclosed the profound connection that he shared with other members of the Beatles. In addition to being pulled together by their mutual passion for music, the musicians in the band went through the traumatic ordeal of losing their mothers when they were in their teenage years. Not long after Lennon's first interaction with Paul McCartney, he suffered the devastating loss of his mother at the age of 17. This resulted in the formation of a special connection between the both of them. After that, it appeared as though McCartney's life, which was still unfinished, had become more complete. Light at the end of the tunnel. As a result of the departure of Stuart Sutcliffe, the original bass player of the Beatles, who went on to pursue other artistic endeavors, the band found themselves confronted with the issue of filling the gap that he had left behind. Following Sutcliffe's departure from the band in 1960, the Beatles reportedly began their search for a permanent replacement, as stated in the article published in 1990 by Ultimate Classic Rock. During a limited period, Chas Newby filled the job. Nevertheless, his dedication to the band was not something that impressed the rest of the band, and it resulted in a very significant occasion for McCartney. Due to the lack of a committed bassist, the band was faced with a difficult situation. Because McCartney was the primary guitarist from the beginning of the band, he found himself in the spotlight of decision-making. As a result of what he saw to be constraints, he made the very difficult decision to transition from lead guitarist to playing rhythm guitar. He continued to adapt to the ever-changing requirements of the band. Following the inability of his guitar to function properly, he took on the duty of the pianist. McCartney finally came to terms with the fact that he was to be the bassist of the Beatles, accepting the fact that this was unavoidable. Although it is possible that the bass was not McCartney's first choice of instrument, he addressed the challenge with the trademark dedication and inventiveness that became a trademark all of his career. There was no denying it. This was a man who was versatile and could adapt to any situation. The magazine, Rolling Stone, acknowledged the mastery that Paul McCartney has on the bass guitar by placing him 9th on their top 50 greatest bassists of all time. John Lennon, known for his charm, became the unquestioned leader of the Beatles when they were still in their formative years, the face of the Beatles. As the middle of the 1960s approached, there was a subtle transfer of power in the Beatles, and McCartney was able to take over the reins of control in a smooth manner. Even though his leadership ushered in an age of success for the band, it also simultaneously planted the seeds of strife among its members. This strife resulted in the development of an undeniable sentiment of separation. The event that led to this transformation can be traced back to 1964. Paul McCartney decided to end the collaborative songwriting partnership between the Beatles, and at the same time, John Lennon wrote the hit song Can't Buy Me Love, which went on to claim the coveted A-side on their upcoming release. Lennon, spurred by artistic competition, also wrote A Hard Day's Night, and the majority of the music on the album had his original name. Throughout the rest of the decade, this dynamic of one-upmanship in song composition became the defining characteristic of their creative relationship with one another. The creative tug-of-war would continue, as McCartney wrote Yesterday, only to be met with Lennon's response in the form of Norwegian Wood. These two artists continued to compete with one another, the pattern continued, with one maestro responding to the auditory endeavors brought forth by the other. "Strawberry Fields Forever" was written by John Lennon, and McCartney responded with "Penny Lane Music." Even though McCartney agreed that the competition was good, as it kept both artists on their toes, Far Out pointed out that there were times when Lennon's nose was out of joint. This is a claim that is asserted by Lan Diamond in his seminal work, Revolution in the Head, The Beatles, and the 79s. He stated that John Lennon perceived the decline of his authority over overactive action. Diamond gets into the core of the matter in this work. Starting from that time moving forward, McCartney rose to prominence, not only as an instrumentalist, but also a songwriter, producer, arranger, and de facto musical director of the Beatles. The Beatles' progress and the intricate dynamics that propelled their unmatched musical journey were signaled by the fact that their harmonic collaboration that had been present in the early days of the band had given way to the complex interplay of artistic egos. False rumors of Paul McCartney's death. Paul McCartney, the most famous member of the Beatles, was said to have passed away and was replaced by a doppelganger, according to a weird and persistent rumor in 1966. During the recording of Sgt. Dr. Pepper's Lullaby, which was sung by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the story is said to have emerged as stated by Ultimate Classic Rock. The story says that McCartney died in an automobile accident, and the remaining members of the band reportedly decided to release a McCartney look-alike, rather than disbanding or bringing in a new member to continue their musical journey without interruptions. The unusual story is investigated by Rolling Stone, which explains that its beginnings may be traced back to an anonymous caller who persuaded radio DJ Russ Gibb to play the White Album unpredictably. A caller asserted that there were concealed messages in songs like Turn Me On and Dead Man, and John Lennon's utterance of I Buried Paul would be exposed shortly. As a result of claimed hints that were embedded in record covers, lyrics, and even music videos, the rumors lingered, even though McCartney had survived the automobile accident. Reporters from Life magazine were sent to McCartney's mansion in Scotland to dispel the rumors that were circulating about him. McCartney's unorthodox answer, which was dousing the reporters with a bucket of water, is highlighted by Rolling Stone. He did not let this rumor get to him, as he accepted an interview and even took pictures in the hopes of putting the unwelcome rumors to rest. Despite all these efforts, the rumors continued to circulate. The end of an era. When the 1960s came to a close, the Beatles realized that they were caught up in a web of tension and animosity regarding their relationship. When their manager, Brian Epstein, passed away in 1967, it created a hole in their relationship and brought to light the cracks that existed in the group, which had previously been very close. The band struggled with creative differences that were brewing beneath the surface since they were deprived of Epstein's leadership. According to Far Out, the moment that would eventually prove to be important occurred on September 20th, 1969. Despite the advice of their new business manager, Alan Klein, who urged them to keep it quiet, John Lennon announced his departure from the group to Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr, who took the role of the drummer. The dissolution of the relationship, as described by individuals, was not unexpected. After getting married, having kids, and each pursuing individual artistic endeavors, the four members of the fabulous band had been living extremely different lives. On the 10th of April 1970, Paul McCartney announced that the Beatles would be disbanding. Life after the Beatles. As the Beatles broke up in 1970, McCartney fell into a depression. His wife helped him pull out of that condition by praising his work as a songwriter and convincing him to continue writing and recording. In her honor, he wrote, "Maybe I'm amazed," explaining that with the Beatles breaking up, that was his feeling. He wrote, "Maybe I'm amazed at what's going on. Maybe I'm a man, and maybe you're the only woman who could ever help me. Baby, won't you help me understand? Maybe I'm amazed at the way you pulled me out of time. Hung me on the line? Maybe I'm amazed at the way I need you. He added that every love song he wrote was for Linda. In 1970, McCartney continued his musical career with his first solo release, McCartney, a US #1 album. Apart from some vocal contributions from Linda, McCartney is a one-man album, with McCartney providing compositions, instrumentation, and vocals. In 1971, he collaborated with Linda and drummer Denny Seiwell on a second album, Ram. A UK #1 and a US top 5, Ram included the co-written US #1 hit single, Uncle Albert Admiral Halsey. Later that year, ex-Moody Blues guitarist Denny Laine joined the McCartneys and Seiwell to form the band Wings. McCartney had this to say on the group's formation: "Wings were always a difficult idea. Any group having to follow the Beatles' success would have a hard job. I found myself in that very position. However, it was a choice between going on or finishing, and I loved music too much to think of stopping." In September 1971, the McCartneys' daughter Stella was born, named in honor of Linda's grandmothers, both of whom were named Stella. Following the addition of guitarist Henry McCullough, Wings' first concert tour began in 1972 with a debut performance in front of an audience of 700 at the University of Nottingham. 10 more gigs followed as they traveled across the UK in a van during an unannounced tour of universities, during which the band stayed in modest accommodation and received pay in coinage, collected from students, while avoiding Beatles songs during their performances. McCartney later said, "The main thing I didn't want was to come on stage, faced with the whole torment of 5 rows of press people with little pads, all looking at me and saying, 'Oh well, he is not as good as he was.' So we decided to go out on that university tour, which made me less nervous. By the end of that tour, I felt ready for something else, so we went into Europe. During the 7-week, 25-show Wings Over Europe tour, the band played almost solely Wings and McCartney solo material. The Little Richard cover, Long Tall Sally, was the only song that the Beatles had previously recorded. McCartney wanted the tour to avoid large venues. Most of the small halls they played had capacities of fewer than 3,000 people. In March 1973, Wings achieved their first US #1 single, My Love, included on their second LP, Red Rose Speedway, a US #1 and UK top 5. McCartney's collaboration with Linda and former Beatles producer Martin resulted in the song Live and Let Die, which was the theme song for the James Bond film of the same name. Nominated for an Academy Award, the song reached #2 in the US and #9 in the UK. It also earned Martin a Grammy for his orchestral arrangement. Music professor and author Vincent Benitez described the track as symphonic rock at its best. After the departure of McCullough and Seiwell in 1973, the McCartneys and Laine recorded Band on the Run. The album was the first of 7 Platinum Wings LPs. It was a US and UK #1, the band's first to top the charts in both countries and the first ever to reach Billboard magazine's charts on 3 separate occasions. One of the best-selling releases of the decade, it remained on the UK charts for 124 weeks. Rolling Stone named it one of the best albums of the year for 1973, and in 1975, Paul McCartney and Wings won the Grammy Award for Best Pop Vocal Performance for the song Band on the Run, and Jeff Emerick won the Grammy for Best Engineered Recording for the album. Wings achieved a second US #1 single, with the title track in 1974. The album also included the top 10 hits Jet and Hell in Wheels, and earned the 418th spot on Rolling Stone's list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. McCartney hired guitarist Jimmy McCulloch and drummer Jeff Britton to replace McCullough and Seiwell. Britton subsequently quit during recording sessions in 1975 and was replaced by Joe English. Wings followed Band on the Run with the chart-topping albums Venus and Mars, 1975, and Wings at the Speed of Sound, 1976. In 1975, they began the 14-month Wings Over the World Tour, which included stops in the UK, Australia, Europe, and the US. The tour marked the first time McCartney performed Beatles songs live with Wings, with 5 in the 2-hour set list. I've Just Seen a Face, Yesterday, Blackbird, Lady Madonna, and The Long and Winding Road. Following the second European leg of the tour and extensive rehearsals in London, the group undertook an ambitious US arena tour that yielded the US #1 live triple LP Wings Over America, the ups and downs of McCartney and Lennon's relationship. From their initial meeting in the late 1950s in Liverpool, McCartney and Lennon began to form a close and creative bond when McCartney joined Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, which later evolved into the Beatles. Over the years, McCartney and Lennon became each other's closest confidants and songwriting collaborators. They complemented each other's talents perfectly, with Lennon often providing the raw, introspective, and sometimes darker edge to their songs, while McCartney contributed catchy melodies and a more optimistic tone. As the Beatles gained popularity in the early 1960s, McCartney and Lennon became the primary songwriters for the band, and during the height of Beatlemania, they enjoyed pushing each other to new creative heights. Their friendly competition fueled their songwriting, resulting in some of the most iconic tracks in the rock and roll canon. However, following the Beatles' breakup in 1970, the pair faced growing tensions. At the same time, much of the deterioration of their friendship was intricate and far from the complete rupture that many fans speculated. They maintained a connection, albeit indirectly through intermediaries and legal channels, and the bitterness between them had largely faded away by the mid-1970s. That said, there was a brief phase when the jabs exchanged between the former Beatles provided a captivating spectacle for onlookers. Lennon and McCartney established a close camaraderie upon their first meeting in 1957, when Lennon was playing with the Quarrymen at a church fete. Both teenagers at the time were introduced by a mutual friend, Ivan Vaughan, and bonded over their passion for music. McCartney, a talented musician himself, initially impressed Lennon with his ability to play and tune a guitar. McCartney also demonstrated his knowledge of rock and roll songs, which led to an informal audition for the Quarrymen, during which he played a few hits, including 20 Flight Rock. Following this, they got on like a house on fire and engaged in relentless songwriting sessions together, eyeball to eyeball, as Lennon explained to Playboy in 1980. Over the years, their partnership evolved, and they would go on to write countless songs together, forming the core songwriting duo of the Beatles. Their friendship and creative synergy played a crucial role in shaping the sound and success of the band, making them one of the most iconic songwriting partnerships in the history of music. McCartney has often reflected on the fondness that he and Lennon shared towards each other during those early years, saying, "We complemented each other. It was a bit of yin and yang," adding, "They say with marriages opposites attract, and I think we weren't madly opposite, but I had some stuff he didn't have, and he had some stuff I didn't have." In the early days, the Beatles' songs were often credited to Lennon-McCartney, an unspoken agreement the pair had to always give equal credit, even if the song was written mainly by one and not the other. In one of the final interviews he gave before his passing, Lennon said, "We always had that thing that our names would go on songs even if we didn't write them. It was never a legal deal between Paul and me, just an agreement to put both our names on our songs." However, as with any business partnership, strain eventually seeped in, and soon McCartney and Lennon were up against stresses in both their personal lives and the corporate world. Their friendship leaned more toward rivalry, and they suddenly found themselves on the cusp of a public fallout. As the 1960s progressed, the Beatles' creative energies were on the decline. In 1968, both Lennon and McCartney reached new heights in their artistic output during the production of the iconic White Album. However, the paths of the songwriters began to diverge significantly, mirroring changes in their personal lives. Lennon, deeply in love and embarking on a passionate romance with Yoko Ono, found himself increasingly isolated as he grappled with a worsening heroin addiction. McCartney's association with Linda McCartney and his father-in-law, Lee Eastman, also added complexity to the dynamics. Therefore, the fallout between Lennon and McCartney can be attributed to a combination of factors. As the Beatles evolved musically and personally, Lennon and McCartney began to have differing visions for the band's direction. McCartney favored a more structured and polished sound, while Lennon was increasingly drawn to experimental and avant-garde music. These creative disparities led to disagreements over songwriting, recording techniques, and artistic choices. The band's structure was also a point of contention. McCartney, in the absence of their manager Brian Epstein, took on a more prominent leadership role, which some members, including Lennon, found overbearing. Lennon felt that McCartney was becoming too controlling and dictatorial in the band's decision-making. Naturally, therefore, distance was created between them on account of their changes during the late 1960s. They were exploring different interests, engaging in activism, and experiencing the pressures of fame in different ways. Business disputes, particularly regarding the management of the Beatles' finances, further strained their relationship. McCartney wanted the band to be more involved in financial matters, while Lennon was more focused on the music. These financial disagreements led to legal battles and contributed to the overall tension. The breaking point came in 1969 when McCartney publicly announced he was leaving the Beatles, which signaled the beginning of the end for the band. Then, when news of the band's breakup finally made headlines in April 1970, it appeared as if it had all been instigated by McCartney. Out of nowhere, he declared that the Beatles were ceasing their musical collaboration and that he was embarking on a solo career. While they had periods of reconciliation in the years that followed, including some collaborations, the deep-seated issues and changes in their lives had fundamentally altered their relationship. While there were many instances where Lennon was accused of seeming jealous of McCartney, particularly in the latter phases of the Beatles' tenure, he didn't ever actually confirm that he was feeling that way. At the same time, a series of comments and diss tracks that followed the Beatles' breakup implied that jealousy floated in the air somewhere, and Lennon and McCartney's feud erupted in the form of various bitter accusations. Even though the dispute continued, Lennon and McCartney did manage to fix their relationship before Lennon's death. One of the most significant steps toward reconciliation occurred in 1974. While Lennon was living in Los Angeles, he and McCartney spontaneously decided to get together. Lennon and his then-girlfriend May Pang visited McCartney's home, and they spent an evening reminiscing about their shared past and playing music. This impromptu meeting helped heal some wounds and marked the beginning of a thaw in their relationship. The same year, the duo had reconciled to the point where they almost formed a supergroup with David Bowie. It was New York, around 1974, Bowie recalled, and I think it was around the first time they had gotten back together again. And I got a knock at the door at the Pierre Hotel, where I had taken over a suite for months and months. It was about 3 a.m, and John was there, and he had Paul with him. Bowie continued. The two of them had been out on the town for the evening, and John says, "You won't believe who I've got here." And I said, "Wow, I thought you two had." And he said, "Oh no, all that's going to change." It was great. We just spent the evening talking. That must have been the first evening they were back together since the big bust-ups. They asked me if I'd join the two of them and become a trio with them, and we'd change the name to something like David Bowie and the Beatles, because they liked the idea of it being DBB. Around the same time, the legal disputes and business disagreements between McCartney and Lennon, along with the other former Beatles, were gradually resolved in the years following the band's breakup. This further helped alleviate some of the lingering tension between them. Even though their relationship had turned sour for several years after the split, both Lennon and McCartney started to express admiration and respect for each other's work in interviews and public statements. They acknowledged each other's contributions to the band and the impact of their songwriting partnership. Then, in 1976, the pair almost made an official comeback. During an episode of Saturday Night Live, the host, Lorne Michaels, directly addressed Lennon and McCartney on the television set about having them come onto the show to perform. Although many of their conversations remained private, Linda McCartney once revealed Lennon's last words to her husband before he died. These were, "Think about me now and then, old friend." American musician Carl Perkins was so moved when he heard those words that he included them in his song, "My Old Friend." When McCartney heard the song, he was so overwhelmed by emotion that he had to leave the room. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and check out another of our interesting videos.